All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep into some foundational management thinking.
Yeah, we're going way back to 1994, back when the internet was, well, a little different.
We're talking about Peter Drucker, his article, The Theory of the Business, a Harvard Business Review classic. Still so relevant.
It really is, a timeless piece.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And for you, our listeners, those of you who really want to get a grip on what makes organizations succeed, this deep dive is like the shortcut.
It is. It's going to be dense, but worth it.
Dense, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to break it down and make it clear. Drucker, yes, this is a fascinating question.
Oh.
Why do successful organizations doing the right things, why do they plateau? Why do they face crises?
Yeah, why do things fall apart even when, it seems like everything's running smoothly?
Exactly. And Drucker, he says it's because, well, they're working off of assumptions, deeply held beliefs about their world, about their business. And those assumptions, they might not hold up anymore.
Right. It's like driving with an outdated map. You might be following the directions perfectly, but if the roads have changed, you're going to end up lost.
A perfect analogy. Okay, so Drucker, he calls this the theory of the business, but it's not like a formal written document.
Not usually, no. It's more like the DNA of the organization, the set of beliefs about its markets, its customers, its technology, even what the organization gets paid for.
It's like the operating system.
Yeah.
It determines how an organization behaves, makes decisions, defines success. And Drucker, he gives some pretty fascinating historical examples, organizations that were built on these very clear theories, and they had incredible long-term success.
Oh, yeah. He talks about the University of Berlin in the early 1800s. Wilhelm von Humboldt, he had this radical idea that universities, they should prioritize research and scholarship above all else. And that one idea, it shaped German higher education for over a century.
And think about that one core assumption, this belief in the importance of scholarship, it had such a huge, lasting impact.
Absolutely. And another example he uses is Deutsche Bank, founded in the 1870s. Georg Siemens, the guy who founded it, he had this assumption that financing industrial development was the key to unifying Germany. And within 2 decades, Deutsche Bank, it became a powerhouse, a leading financial institution in Europe.
And then there's Mitsubishi, right? Started in the 1870s in Japan. And they were founded on this whole new set of beliefs about modernizing Japan, about the potential of multinational business. And guess what?
They became domestic leaders within a decade, global players soon after.
Amazing. But then there's the flip side, right? What happens when these theories, these core assumptions, become outdated?
That's when things get interesting and a little dangerous.
Yeah. And Drucker, he uses IBM and General Motors as examples, really powerful illustrations of what can go wrong.
Yeah, those are some classic case studies.
So IBM, for years, their big belief, their core assumption was that, well, computing was going to be all about mainframes.
Right. Big, centralized computers, like a power grid. Lots of users connecting to one central source.
And for a while, for a good while, the market, it seemed to prove them right. But then along came the personal computer, the PC.
And initially, a lot of folks, including IBM, they dismissed the PC. They thought it was like a toy, not a real computer.
Yeah, like a fad. But IBM, they did something interesting, something pretty remarkable for such a big company.
They actually moved pretty fast. They saw the potential, They set up these independent teams to develop their own PC.
And in 2 years?
Yeah, about 2 years. They became the dominant force in the PC market. They were setting the standards.
But then just a few years later, they were struggling.
Yeah.
Struggling in both the mainframe and the PC businesses.
So they adapted, right? But they adapted while clinging to this outdated assumption, the assumption that a computer is a computer.
Right. And Drucker, he says that's the problem. He makes this great analogy. He says mainframe and a PC are not the same thing any more than a power plant is the same as a toaster.
One generates power, the other consumes it. They're both electrical, but they're totally different businesses.
And IBM, they were trying to be both the power plant and the toaster. And they ended up, not really dominating either. Their core assumption, it held them back.
Now, GM, they're another really interesting case. Drucker argues that they had this even more powerful, more enduring theory of the business than IBM.
Yeah. And their theory, it was based on this idea that the U.S. auto market was pretty homogenous, divided by income groups.
Yeah.
And that trade-in values, they were super important.
Right. They believed that by controlling used car prices, they could, encourage people to keep trading up to newer, more expensive cars. And to do that, they needed to avoid like radical model changes because those would hurt trade-in values.
And this belief about the market, it fit perfectly with their assumptions about production.
Yeah, they focused on long production runs, standardized cars, minimal changes year to year. It was all about maximizing profits in this big homogeneous market.
And for decades, it worked. I mean, it worked brilliantly. But then in the late 70s, things started to change.
Yeah.
The market, it wasn't so homogeneous anymore. Consumer preferences, they fragmented. People were buying cars based on lifestyle, not just income.
Right. And at the same time, lean manufacturing came along. And suddenly, smaller production runs, more model diversity, they became more cost-effective.
And GM, they had a hard time letting go of that old theory. They tried to patch things up. They kept those income-based divisions, but they told each one, okay, you got to offer a car for every person purpose.
And it didn't work. It just led to confusion. Consumers were confused. Dealers were confused. Even GM's own employees were confused.
And what's even crazier is they totally missed out on this huge opportunity.
The light truck and minivan market?
They had an early lead there. They could have dominated, but their old assumptions, they blinded them. They couldn't see the shift in the market.
And those are, I think, some pretty good reasons for our listeners to pay attention to their own assumptions, because they can really make or break you.
Absolutely. So, okay, how do we do this? How do we figure out our theory of the business? Drucker, he breaks it down into 3 parts, 3 key components.
The first part is all about the external environment. Your assumptions about society, the market, your customers, and technology. And this is where you define what your organization gets paid for.
Then second, you've got your assumptions about your mission. What are your specific goals? How are you going to make a difference in that environment?
And Drucker gives some great examples here, right? He talks about Sears. Their early mission was to be the informed buyer for the American family. Marks and Spencer, they wanted to be a classless retailer, a force for social change in Britain. AT&T, they were all about universal telephone access. Each of these companies, they had a very specific idea of how they were going to create value.
And then the third part, you got to have assumptions about your core competencies. What are the essential skills and strengths you need to achieve your mission?
Right. So, for example, West Point, they're all about developing leaders with integrity. Marks and Spencer, they moved beyond just buying goods to actually designing and developing their own merchandise. And AT&T, their focus was on technical excellence, always improving service, lowering costs for consumers.
Okay, so you've got these 3 parts, but it's not enough just to have a theory. It's got to be a valid theory.
Exactly. And Drucker, he gives us 4 key specifications, like a checklist.
First one, fit with reality. Your assumptions, they got to match up with the real world.
Yeah. He uses Marks and Spencer again as an example. After World War I, they saw that British society was changing. There was this new class of consumers, and they wanted affordable, high-quality goods. So Marks and Spencer, they shifted their mission to meet that need, and they developed the core competence of in-house design to actually create those goods. Their theory, it fit the new reality.
Second specification, internal consistency. All your assumptions, they got to fit together. They got to support each other.
Right, and Drucker uses GM as a good example, at least in the early days. Their assumptions about the market, a big, homogeneous market, it fit with their mass production process. And that, in turn, led them to develop strong financial controls. Everything was aligned.
Third, organizational awareness. Everyone in the organization, they got to understand the theory.
This is a big one, because it's easy, especially when you're successful, to just take the theory for granted. It becomes part of the culture, but people stop thinking about it. And that can be dangerous, because when the world changes, you need to be able to question those assumptions.
And the fourth, the final specification, constant testing. Your theory, it's not a set-in-stone doctrine. It's a hypothesis. You got to constantly be testing it against reality.
Because the world is always changing. And Drucker, he's very clear about this. He says all theories, no matter how successful they've been, they eventually become obsolete.
He gives examples, right? The big American businesses of the 1920s, GM, AT&T, IBM, even Deutsche Bank and the Japanese Keiretsu, all of them. Their theories eventually stopped working.
And that's the thing, right? You can be doing everything right, according to your theory, but if the theory itself is wrong, you're still going to run into trouble.
So what do you do? What happens when you see the signs that your theory is starting to break down?
Well, Drucker, he says the first reaction is usually denial. You try to ignore the problem, and then you try to patch things up, make a few adjustments here and there, hoping that will fix it.
But he says that patching, it almost never works in the long run. You got to be willing to go deeper, to question your fundamental assumptions.
And for that, he recommends two things: preventive care and early diagnosis, like with your health, right?
Exactly. So for preventive care, he suggests something called systematic abandonment. Every 3 years, you look at every product, every service, every policy, and you ask, if we weren't already doing this, would we start it now?
And that can be a really tough question to ask, but it forces you to really think about what you're doing and why.
And the second preventive measure, he says you got to study non-customers, the people who aren't buying from you.
Because they can often tell you more about the changing market than your existing customers can.
He uses department stores as an example. They were so focused on their existing customers, they completely missed out on this huge segment of the market, the time-conscious baby boomer women. They were customer-driven, but not market-driven.
And then there's early diagnosis,
Right.
recognizing the warning signs that your theory is becoming obsolete.
And the first sign, he says, is when you achieve your original objectives. You might think, great, we made it. But that's actually the time to step back and reassess. Because what got you here might not get you where you need to go next.
Right. And then there's rapid growth. If your organization is growing really fast, that can put a lot of stress on your existing theory.
And then there's unexpected success, either your own or a competitor's.
He talks about Chrysler, their success with Jeeps and minivans. While their regular car sales were struggling, GM, they had trucks, but they didn't really see the bigger picture that consumer preferences were shifting.
And finally, there's unexpected failure, your own or a competitor's.
Like Sears, their attempt to sell investment products, it was a total flop, and that should have made them question their assumptions about the market.
So, okay, let's say you see the signs. Your theory needs to change. What do? Drucker? He says it's not about finding a miracle worker. It's about hard work. Diagnosis? Analysis.
And he gives examples of CEOs who did this successfully, like the guy who led Merck's shift towards generics and over-the-counter drugs, and the guy who took Sony from hardware to software.
But he's clear. You can't just wait for a hero to come along.
Right.
Effective leaders, they recognize that change is inevitable, they see those warning signs, and they act.
So, to sum it all up, Drucker's big message is this: having a clear, consistent, and constantly tested theory of the business, that's the foundation of long-term success. If you don't do that, you're setting yourself up for trouble.
No matter how good you are at execution.
Right. Execution is important, but it's not enough. You got to have the right theory.
So for you, our listeners, this deep dive into Drucker, it's a tool, a framework for understand not just businesses, but really any organization.
Any endeavor where you're trying to achieve something.
And here's a thought, something to think about as you go about your day.
Yeah.
Think of an organization you admire, or one that's facing challenges. What do you think their theory of the business is? Does it fit the reality? What assumptions might they need to rethink? Just a little something to chew on.
Food for thought. And on that note, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.